Arrogant millionaire ruins dying lady's last wish, but ends up losing everything to save her life in Paris. Hello my beautiful family, welcome back to our sacred storytelling home. You know, it feels like coming home every time I sit down to share these powerful stories with you. Each like, share, and subscription fuels this journey we're on together. I see your comments, I feel your support, and I'm grateful that we've built this community together. Whether you're a long-time viewer or this is your first time joining us, know that you're valued here. This space we've created is about more than just storytelling, it's about connecting hearts across distances, finding meaning in life's unexpected moments, and recognizing ourselves in others' journeys. Thank you for being here today. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to extend a blessing to each of you, my family. Heavenly Father, as we're gathered here today, about to share today's story, I ask that you watch over everyone listening right now. Bring peace to their troubled hearts, strength to their weary bodies, and clarity to their confused minds. Whatever challenges they face today, may they find the courage to overcome them. Bless their homes with laughter, their relationships with understanding, and their futures with hope. Protect them from harm and surround them with love. May they feel your presence in their lives and know they are never alone. Thank you for bringing us together today. Amen. Last night, I couldn't sleep. I was thinking about all of you or my viewers who have stuck with me through every story I've shared. I spent hours wondering what meaningful story I could bring to you today that would touch your hearts. Then I remembered something my grandfather once told me when I was very young. He said, "The richest people aren't those with the most money, but those who learn compassion at the moment they need it most." His words, though short, have stayed with me through the years, and they came flooding back when I got the idea of today's story, which I'm about to share with you. It's about wealth and poverty, not just of money, but of spirit. About how sometimes we must lose everything to gain what truly matters. Today's story embodies that lesson perfectly, and I've worked on it for weeks to bring it to you in the most authentic way possible. It challenged me, moved me, and ultimately changed how I view success and connection. So, as we're about to begin, drop a comment with "I'm here family" and let me know where you're watching from, especially my family in the USA and Caribbean. I love seeing your locations pop up in real time. It reminds me how our stories connect us across oceans and borders. Your comments fuel these videos and help our community grow stronger. I read every single one of them and try to respond to as many as I can. Now that you've done that, settle in and perhaps grab a warm drink. Turn down the lights, get comfortable, and prepare your heart for what's coming. Let's begin. The Boston skyline glowed golden in the afternoon sun as Grace Wilson sat perfectly still in the sterile examination room. At 28, she had always been the type to plan ahead. Teaching kindergarten had taught her the value of preparation. But nothing could have prepared her for what Dr. Winters was about to tell her. "I wish I had better news, Grace," Dr. Winters said, her voice softening as she placed the scan results on her desk. "The cancer has progressed significantly. It's stage 4 now, and it's spread to multiple organs." Grace nodded, her honey-brown eyes fixed on a small bird outside the window. Somehow, she had known this was coming. The increasing pain, the weight loss, the exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix, her body had been warning her. "How long?" Grace asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Dr. Winters removed her glasses. "With aggressive pain management and palliative care, about a week. Maybe 10 days. A week. 7 days. 168 hours. "I understand," Grace said, though she didn't, not really. How could anyone understand having their life reduced to a handful of days? "We should discuss hospice options," Dr. Winters continued, but Grace was already reaching into her bag, pulling out a small notebook bound in worn leather. "I have a list," Grace said, her finger trailing down a page filled with her neat handwriting. Things I wanted to do someday. I guess someday needs to be this week. Dr. Winters waited patiently as Grace flipped through the pages. Most of these won't be possible now, Grace said, a sad smile crossing her face. Seeing the northern lights, walking the Great Wall, but there's one thing. One last wish. She turned the book around, showing a magazine clipping taped to one of the pages. The glossy photograph showed an elegant restaurant with crystal chandeliers and tables draped in white linen. LaSalle, Grace explained. It's supposed to be the most authentic French restaurant in America. The chef trained in Paris for 15 years before opening in New York. I've always wanted to experience true French cuisine, to taste a little piece of Paris before. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Back in her small apartment, Grace called the restaurant, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed. LaSalle, how may I assist you? Came a polished voice with the faintest hint of a French accent. I'd like to make a reservation for tomorrow evening, Grace said. I'm afraid we're fully booked for the next 6 months. We could accommodate you in October, perhaps? October. By October, Grace would be nothing but a memory, a name on a gravestone, a photo her students' parents would struggle to explain. It's very important, Grace tried, hating the desperation creeping into her voice. A special occasion. I'm sorry. Perhaps another establishment would be more suitable? After hanging up, Grace sat on her bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror across the room. The woman looking back at her seemed already half gone, her once vibrant features now shadowed by illness. Her gaze drifted to her closet, where a cream-colored dress hung in plastic. She'd bought it for her cousin's wedding next spring, a wedding she would never attend. Standing up, Grace walked to the closet and removed the dress. It was simple but elegant, with delicate beadwork along the neckline. Perfect for a special evening out. 6-month waiting list or not, she whispered to her reflection, I'm going to dine at LaSalle tomorrow night. She laid the dress on her bed, smoothing the fabric with her thin fingers. It's my last wish. And I'm not letting go of it without a fight. LaSalle stood proudly on the corner of Fifth Avenue, its elegant facade illuminated by tasteful gold lighting. The restaurant wasn't just a place to eat, it was the crown jewel of Richard Hayes' expanding empire, a testament to his ruthless climb from nothing to everything. Inside, the restaurant hummed with controlled precision. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in crisp white linen. Wait staff moved silently across the polished marble floors, their movements choreographed to appear effortless. The air carried hints of truffle, saffron, and wealth, a carefully curated atmosphere that whispered of exclusivity. Behind the scenes, in his private office, Richard Hayes stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting his custom-made tie. At 35, he had the sharp, handsome features of a man who had never doubted his path. Born in a struggling neighborhood in Chicago, he'd clawed his way out through sheer determination and a complete willingness to step over anyone who stood in his way. Mr. Hayes, his assistant, Thomas, appeared in the doorway. The Preston group will arrive in 30 minutes for their dinner meeting. Richard didn't turn from the mirror. Is everything prepared in the private dining room? Yes, sir. Chef Bernard has prepared the special menu you requested, and the 1982 Bordeaux has been decanted. And the contracts? Printed and ready for signatures after the main course, as you instructed. Richard finally turned, his steel-gray eyes surveying his assistant with cool assessment. Good. This acquisition will double our holdings in the Midwest. I want everything perfect. Of course, sir. As Thomas turned to leave, Richard added, "And tell Bernard if he overcooks the duck again, he can pack his knives and head back to whatever provincial kitchen he came from." "Yes, Mr. Hayes." Richard moved through his restaurant, inspecting every detail with critical eyes. He straightened a slightly askew painting, adjusted a flower arrangement, and wiped an invisible smudge from a glass door with his handkerchief. "Mr. Hayes," a server approached nervously, "we've had a last-minute request for a table tonight. I know we're fully booked, but—" "Then the answer is no," Richard cut him off without breaking stride. "Our exclusivity is not negotiable. That's why people wait 6 months for a reservation." "Yes, sir. I understand." In the kitchen, his presence caused an immediate change in atmosphere. The sous chef stood straighter, their movements becoming more precise under his watchful gaze. Chef Bernard, a burly Frenchman with impressive credentials, nodded respectfully as Richard approached. "Mr. Hayes, tonight's menu is—" "I'm not interested in explanations, Bernard. I'm interested in perfection. The Preston Group represents a $50 million opportunity. What have you prepared?" As Bernard detailed the evening's offerings, Richard's phone buzzed. Another congratulatory message from a business associate, not a friend, never a friend. Just another person who wanted to be close to his success, his money, his power. Richard slipped the phone back into his pocket without responding. Tonight was about business, not connections. Connections were weaknesses, vulnerabilities that could be exploited. He'd learned that lesson early and never forgotten it. "Sir," Thomas approached again, "your table is ready for your preliminary meeting with the legal team before the Preston Group arrives." Richard nodded and headed toward his private table in the corner of the main dining room, a spot that allowed him to observe the entire restaurant while remaining somewhat separate from it. Just as he preferred in life, watching everything, connected to nothing. As he sat down, he surveyed his domain with cold satisfaction. Everything he had, he'd built himself. Every person here worked for him. Every detail existed according to his vision. LaSalle wasn't just a restaurant, it was a monument to his complete control. The evening air had a bite to it as Grace stepped out of the taxi in front of LaSalle. She took a moment to steady herself, one hand clutching her small purse, the other pressed against her side where the pain had settled like an unwelcome tenant. The cream-colored dress felt looser than when she'd bought it, her body had surrendered so much in the past few months. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, straightening her shoulders. One night. One meal. One wish. She approached the entrance, where a doorman in an impeccable uniform regarded her with practiced neutrality. "Good evening, miss. Do you have a reservation?" Grace took a deep breath. "No, but I was hoping." "I'm afraid LaSalle only accommodates guests with reservations," he said, already looking past her to the next approaching car. "Please," Grace said, her voice low but firm. "This is important to me. More than you know." Something in her tone made the doorman look at her, really look at her this time. His expression softened marginally. "Wait here," he said finally. Minutes later, Grace found herself being led through the restaurant toward the bar area. "You may wait here," the host told her. "If there's a cancellation, we'll try to accommodate you." It was more than she'd expected. The bar was elegant, with high stools upholstered in deep blue velvet. Grace carefully seated herself, trying to ignore how the simple effort left her winded. At the other end of the bar, Richard Hayes was inspecting the evening's appetizers. The Preston group would be arriving soon, and he was determined that every detail would be flawless. "Let me taste this," he commanded, pointing to an elegantly plated foie gras. The bartender slid the plate toward him. Richard sampled it critically, his expression revealing nothing as he evaluated the flavor. "More salt," he decided firmly. "And tell Bernard the presentation is mediocre at best." As he finished his tasting, a drop of sauce clung to the corner of his mouth. He looked around impatiently for a napkin, but the bartender had stepped away to relay his criticism to the kitchen. Grace had moved closer along the bar, hoping to catch someone's attention about possibly ordering a small appetizer while she waited. She stood just beside Richard now, unaware of who he was or his irritated state. Without hesitation, Richard reached out and grabbed the edge of her cream-colored dress, using the delicate fabric to wipe his mouth. Grace gasped, turning in shock. "Hey! That's my dress." "Sir, what are you doing?" Richard looked at her with mild irritation, as if she were an unexpected inconvenience rather than a person whose property he'd just defiled. With deliberate slowness, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a money clip. "Take $50,000, he said, peeling off several bills and holding them out to her. "Buy yourself a new one." Grace stared at the money, then at the man. His casual arrogance struck her more forcefully than her illness ever had. "Excuse me, sir, but this is too much," she said, her voice tight with indignation as she pushed his hand away, sending the bills fluttering to the floor. "You can't just—" "Security," Richard called, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "Please help me with this." A large man in a dark suit approached immediately. "Yes, Mr. Hayes?" Grace looked from the security guard to Richard. "Why are you even listening to him?" Richard's lip curled slightly. Because this is my place. My restaurant. And everything here belongs to me." He adjusted his perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket with a practiced flick of his wrists. "You can lose it all in one single moment," Grace said, her words quiet but charged with meaning. Something flickered in Richard's eyes, not regret, not yet, but perhaps the first crack in his perfect composure. "Get her out of here," he commanded the guard, already turning away. The security guard took Grace's arm gently but firmly. As he guided her toward the exit, Grace's vision began to blur at the edges. The pain in her side sharpened, stealing her breath. She stumbled, her knees buckling beneath her. "Miss? Are you all right?" the guard asked, his professional demeanor giving way to concern. Grace couldn't answer. The room tilted around her as darkness encroached on her vision. As she collapsed, her gaze locked with Richard's across the restaurant. In that final moment of consciousness, something passed between them, an unspoken recognition, a thread connecting their fates. Then Grace's eyes closed, and she crumpled to the floor as gasps echoed through the stunned restaurant. "Get my car!" Richard barked into his phone as medical personnel rushed through the restaurant's entrance. The commotion around the collapsed woman sent ripples of disturbance through his perfectly controlled environment. Guests were staring, whispering behind manicured hands, the evening's elegant atmosphere shattered. This wasn't part of the plan. The Preston group would arrive any minute to sign contracts worth millions, and instead of impressing them with impeccable service, they'd be greeted by paramedics wheeling a stretcher through the dining room. "Sir, she's extremely unstable," one of the EMTs said as they worked over the pale woman. "We need to move her now." Richard paced nearby, running calculations in his head. A lawsuit would be bad press. Bad press meant lost reservations. Lost reservations meant declining profits. And if she died on his property? Mr. Hayes, Thomas approached cautiously. The Preston group has arrived. They're waiting in there. Tell them something came up. Reschedule for tomorrow. Thomas blinked in surprise. But sir, they've flown in specifically for. Just do it, Richard snapped, watching as the paramedics lifted the woman onto a stretcher. Her cream dress spilled over the edges, the fabric he'd so carelessly used now rumpled beneath the straps securing her frail body. As they rushed her outside to the waiting ambulance, Richard made a decision. Follow that ambulance, he ordered his driver as he slid into the back seat of his Bentley. And call our lawyers. I want them on standby. The city lights blurred past as they wove through Manhattan traffic, trailing the ambulance's flashing lights. Richard's mind raced faster than the car. What did he know about her? Nothing. Who might she sue him through? Unknown. How much would this cost him? Potentially millions. By the time they reached the hospital, Richard had prepared his approach. He straightened his tie, adjusted his cufflinks, and strode through the emergency room doors with the confidence of a man who owned the building. The woman who just came in by ambulance, he demanded at the reception desk. I need information on her condition. Are you family? The nurse asked without looking up. I'm Richard Hayes, he replied, as if that explained everything. The nurse remained unimpressed. Unless you're family, I can't. My establishment is where she collapsed. This is a liability issue, he pressed, lowering his voice to add, I'm prepared to make a substantial donation to this hospital if necessary. 20 minutes and several thinly veiled threats later, Richard found himself in a sterile hallway, intercepting a doctor emerging from the examination room. Dr. Landry, Richard approached, having obtained the physician's name from a more cooperative staff member. I need to know about the woman brought in from LaSalle restaurant. The doctor, a tired-looking man in his 50s, assessed Richard with weary eyes. And you are? The owner of where she collapsed. Is she going to be all right? Dr. Landry's expression shifted subtly. She didn't have much time left to live anyway. Richard felt his heart skip a beat. What does that mean? She has stage 4 cancer. Terminal. Days, not weeks. The doctor's voice was matter-of-fact. So, you can go back to your party. Or wherever you came from. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He'd been prepared for accusations, for financial demands, for the calculated dance of legal liability. He hadn't been prepared for this. I didn't do anything to her, I swear, he said, the word sounding hollow even to his own ears. Dr. Landry looked at him with something between pity and disgust. Maybe not directly. But whatever happened at your restaurant certainly didn't help a woman living her final days. Richard stood frozen in the hallway as the doctor walked away, the realization washing over him, he hadn't just ruined someone's evening. He might have stolen some of the last moments she had left on Earth. Richard Hayes never waits. Not for elevators, not in traffic, not for tables at restaurants, even ones he didn't own. He was a man perpetually in motion, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Yet here he sat in the hospital waiting room, surrounded by worn magazines and people whose lives had temporarily derailed. The vinyl chair stuck uncomfortably to the back of his designer suit. The fluorescent lights cast everyone in a sickly pallor, making it impossible to tell who was patient and who was visitor. This was a place he couldn't control, couldn't buy, couldn't intimidate into submission. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. The Preston Group deal, the acquisition he'd spent months orchestrating, had slipped away hours ago. Yet strangely, Richard found he couldn't leave. Coffee? Richard looked up to see a kind-faced nurse holding out a paper cup. He accepted it wordlessly, the warmth seeping into his cold fingers. "You've been sitting here for hours," she observed. "Most people at least bring a book." "I didn't plan to be here," Richard replied, staring into the dark liquid. "No one ever does." As she walked away, Richard closed his eyes, the sterile hospital smell triggering unwanted memories. 25 years earlier. "Richard, honey, I need you to be brave for me." His mother's voice was thin, stretched like she was trying to make it cover more space than it could. 12-year-old Richard sat beside her hospital bed, holding her work-roughened hand. "When are you coming home?" he asked. "Soon," she promised, though the dark circles under her eyes told a different story. "Mrs. Kershaw will check on you after her shift. There's food in the fridge. You remember how to heat it up?" Richard nodded. He'd been heating his own meals for years. On the nights his mother worked double shifts at the diner and the hospital reception desk. "And your homework?" "I did it already," he assured her. He always did his homework. He'd learned early that excellence was his only way out. "That's my smart boy." Her smile was a brief flicker before pain erased it. Later that night, alone in their small apartment, Richard made a vow as he ate cold spaghetti from a plastic container, he would never be powerless again. Never at the mercy of circumstance. Never waiting for someone else to determine his fate. Present day. Richard's phone vibrated, pulling him from the memory. Thomas's name flashed on the screen. "Mr. Hayes, is everything all right? The Preston Group is extremely displeased with tonight's cancellation. They're threatening to walk away from the deal entirely." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. "Offer them exclusive access to the chef's table for a year. And send a case of the 82 Bordeaux to their hotel." "Sir, that wine is—" "Just do it, Thomas." "And the contracts?" Richard glanced toward the hallway where doctors moved with purposeful strides. "They'll wait." I don't understand, sir. This isn't like you." "I'll be unavailable for the rest of the night." "Handle it." Richard ended the call before Thomas could respond. A different doctor, younger than Landry, with kind eyes, approached him. "Mr. Hayes?" She stabilized. "We've managed to control her pain for now, but her condition remains critical." "Can I?" Richard hesitated, unfamiliar with asking permission for anything. "Can I see her?" The doctor assessed him carefully. "She's resting." "Are you family?" "No." "Then I'm afraid." "Please." The word felt foreign on his tongue. Something in his expression must have convinced the doctor. 5 minutes. Not a second more. As Richard stood to follow, he caught his reflection in a darkened window, his perfect suit wrinkled, his carefully styled hair disheveled, his eyes holding an emotion he rarely permitted, uncertainty. "My dear family, I'm sure you're already feeling the tension just as I am while the story unfolds. Now I want to take a brief pause to ask you. Have you ever been in a situation just like Richard, where you judged someone only to learn there was so much more to their story? Share your experiences in the comments below. I love to read them. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you've not done that yet, so you'll become a part of our storytelling family. Let's continue. The hospital room was dimly lit, medical equipment casting strange shadows on the walls. Grace lay still, her skin nearly as white as the sheets tucked around her. And four dripped steadily into her arm, and a monitor beeped a quiet rhythm that marked each heartbeat. Richard stood awkwardly by the door, a stranger in this intimate space of suffering. He'd convinced himself that seeing her stable would be enough. He could leave with a clearer conscience, return to his world where problems could be solved with money and power. Yet his feet refused to carry him back out the door. Instead, he found himself moving closer, taking in the details he'd missed during their brief encounter, the faint freckles across her nose, the slight curl in her hair, the delicate bones of her wrists where hospital bracelets now circled like oversized jewelry. "I don't know your name," he said softly to her unconscious form. "I own the restaurant you wanted to visit, and I don't even know your name." The chart at the foot of her bed provided the answer: Grace Wilson. It suited her, he thought. There had been a certain grace in how she'd stood up to him, even as her body was failing her. Richard lowered himself into the chair beside her bed, the plastic squeaking under his weight. Outside the window, the city glittered, indifferent to the dramas unfolding in countless rooms like this one. A slight movement drew his attention back to the bed. Grace's eyelids fluttered, then opened. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. Then her eyes found Richard, and recognition dawned. "You?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. I wanted to make sure you were all right." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Afraid I'll sue?" The question should have relieved him. It was exactly what he'd been worried about hours ago. Instead, it made him feel hollow. "Maybe I should apologize to you," he said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. Grace studied him, her gaze far more penetrating than someone in her condition should be capable of. "You want forgiveness?" "I didn't know you were sick," he said, immediately regretting how defensive it sounded. "Would it have changed anything if you had?" she asked, her tone genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Richard had no answer for that. "I had one last wish," Grace continued, her voice strengthening slightly. "To go to the best French restaurant. To taste Paris before I—" She left the sentence unfinished. The weight of what he'd stolen from her pressed down on Richard's chest. "I'm sorry," he said, and for perhaps the first time in his adult life, he meant it sincerely. "You ruined everything," she said, turning her face away. "I know." Grace looked back at him, surprise flickering across her features. "You know, there's no way I'd forgive you. Even for $1 million." The corner of Richard's mouth twitched. "Only $1 million? Fine. $1 billion. That's more like it, right?" Her face revealed a slight smirk as she turned to face the other side. They fell into silence, the beeping monitors filling the space between them. Richard found himself searching for words, something to offer this woman whose final wish he'd destroyed. "I should let you rest," he said finally, rising from the chair. Grace nodded, her eyelids already growing heavy. "Yes, you should go back to your perfect restaurant and your perfect life." Richard hesitated at the door. Is there anything you need?" "Nothing you can give me," she murmured as sleep reclaimed her. Hours later, Richard stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment, staring out at the city below. The lights of Manhattan created a false dawn, a glow that never quite faded even in the darkest hours of night. Behind him, his phone had been buzzing constantly, Thomas with updates about the Preston Group, his lawyers wondering about the hospital situation, business associates questioning his sudden disappearance from his own restaurant. He'd answered none of them. In his hand, he held a small leather-bound notebook, Grace's bucket list, which he'd convinced a nurse to retrieve from her personal belongings. He'd flipped through it, reading the dreams of a woman who would never have time to fulfill them. In the reflection of the glass, Richard watched himself nod once, decisively. The Richard Hayes who had entered LaSalle that evening would not recognize the man making this decision. But then, that Richard Hayes had never met Grace Wilson. He turned from the window and reached for his phone. The physical therapy room was painted a cheerful yellow that did nothing to alleviate the pain coursing through Grace's body. Each movement was a negotiation with her failing muscles, each breath a reminder of her shrinking timeline. "That's enough for today," the therapist said gently, noting Grace's pallor. "You did well." Grace managed a smile, though it took nearly as much effort as the exercises. "Not really, but thank you for pretending." A nurse helped her back to her wheelchair, and together they made their way through the hospital corridors. Grace closed her eyes as they moved, conserving what little energy she had left. The sound of hushed voices and hurried footsteps ahead made her open them again. "What's happening?" she asked, noticing unusual activity around her room. The nurse seemed equally confused. "I'm not sure. Let me check." As they turned the corner, Grace's breath caught in her throat. People in crisp white uniforms were streaming in and out of her hospital room, carrying trays, linens, and flowers. "Excuse me," the nurse called out, "this is a patient area." "You can't." "It's all been cleared with Dr. Landry," a familiar voice responded, and Richard Hayes stepped into view, looking immaculate in a tailored navy suit. His eyes found Grace's. "Welcome back." What is this?" Grace asked as the nurse wheeled her closer. Richard gestured toward her room. "May I?" Still stunned, Grace nodded. He took control of her wheelchair, guiding her toward the doorway. The transformation was complete. Her sterile hospital room had become an elegant dining space. The harsh overhead lights were dimmed, replaced by the soft glow of candles in crystal holders. A table draped in white linen stood where the visitor chairs had been. The medical equipment had been discreetly rearranged, still functional, but no longer the room's focal point. "What's going on here?" Grace asked, wonder mixing with suspicion in her voice. "Well," Richard said, positioning her wheelchair by the window, "if you can't go to the restaurant, let me bring the restaurant to you." Grace's eyes welled with tears she couldn't quite hold back. "You did this for me? Consider it a proper apology." His voice was gruff, uncomfortable with the emotion underlying his gesture. A small smile formed on Grace's lips. "Okay, it works for me." "Good." Richard nodded, businesslike. "The chef will begin serving in 30 minutes. "I have 2 requests," Grace said, her voice stronger than it had been since her collapse. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." "First, I need a dress." "I can't exactly dine in this," she said, gesturing to her hospital gown. "Turn around," he instructed. Curious, Grace allowed the nurse to help her turn her wheelchair. There, hanging on the bathroom door, was a simple yet elegant red dress. Not ostentatious, but clearly expensive, the kind that would move beautifully even if the wearer did not. "It's perfect," she breathed. "How did you know my size?" Richard cleared his throat. "I have a good eye for measurements. It's adjustable if needed." "And my second request," Grace continued, "I want to have dinner with some handsome guy." Richard glanced around, then motioned to one of his staff members. "James can." "No," Grace interrupted, amusement dancing in her eyes. "I meant, you would be good for that." For perhaps the first time in his life, Richard Hayes looked genuinely caught off guard. He recovered quickly, but not before Grace caught the flash of uncertainty across his features. Of course," he said finally. "I'd be honored." As the staff helped Grace prepare, Richard stood outside her door, giving orders that grew progressively less urgent. For a man who always knew his next move, he suddenly found himself venturing into unfamiliar territory, a dinner with no business agenda, no contracts to sign, nothing to gain. Just a meal with a dying woman who had somehow pierced the armor he'd spent decades building. The meal began formally, almost awkwardly, two strangers bound by circumstance rather than choice. Chef Bernard had outdone himself, preparing a 5-course French dinner that rivaled anything served at LaSalle. The hospital room filled with the aromas of butter, herbs, and reduction sauces that had been simmering for hours. "This is incredible," Grace said, taking a small bite of the duck confit. Despite her condition limiting her appetite, she savored each taste with evident pleasure. "Bernard trained in Paris for 15 years, Richard replied, falling back on facts rather than feelings. "He studied under Chef Moreau at La Maison de Riz." Grace set down her fork. "Tell me about you, not about your chef's credentials." Richard shifted in his seat. "There isn't much to tell." "I doubt that." Her gaze was direct, challenging. "A man doesn't build an empire without a story." "It's not particularly interesting," he deflected. "What about you? What made you want to visit LaSalle so badly?" A soft smile played across Grace's lips. "My mother was French. She passed when I was 10, but I remember her stories about Paris, the cafes, the food, the culture. She always promised to take me someday." Grace traced the rim of her water glass with one finger. "When I got my diagnosis, I thought maybe I could at least taste a piece of that dream." The admission hung in the air between them, a reminder of time's merciless march. "I've never been to Paris," Richard confessed, surprising himself with the admission. Grace looked up, genuinely surprised. "With all your resources?" "Why not?" "Never saw the point." Business is business, whether it's conducted in New York or Paris. "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard," Grace said, but her tone held no judgment, only a gentle teasing. Richard felt a smile tug at his lips, unpracticed, but genuine. "Is that how you speak to all your dining companions?" "Only the ones who use my dress as a napkin." Their laughter broke the remaining tension, and the conversation began to flow naturally. Grace told him about her kindergarten classroom, about finger-painting disasters and the profound wisdom that sometimes emerged from 5-year-olds. "Last winter, this little boy, Tommy, came in crying because another child said his drawing was ugly. I was about to intervene with the usual everyone's art is special speech, but before I could, Tommy's best friend put an arm around him and said, 'Don't worry, you're just getting all the bad drawings out first so the good ones can come later.'" Richard found himself genuinely captivated. Quite the philosopher. Yeah, children often are, when adults bother to listen. she said, tilting her head, studying him. Now your turn. Tell me something real, Richard Hayes. Something you don't put in press releases. Perhaps it was the unusual setting, or the knowledge that Grace's days were limited, but Richard found himself speaking truths he rarely acknowledged even to himself. I was 12 when my mother got sick, he said, the words emerging stiffly at first. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. We never had enough, but she made sure I never felt the lack. When she died, I went into the system. Foster homes, mostly. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. I decided then that I would never be at the mercy of circumstance again. That I would build something no one could take away. He said, straightening the silverware beside his plate, aligning it perfectly. You know it's ironic, considering. Considering what? How easily it could all disappear. And how little it would matter if it did. Richard reached across the table, his fingers light on her wrist. Nobody has ever dared to act with me the way you did back at the restaurant. For some reason, it really got to me. You weren't impressed by my money or my name or my power. Well, I was a little busy dying, she said with a wry smile. You still are, he replied, covering her hand with his. Yet here you are, living more fully than I have in years. Morning sunlight streamed through the hospital window, catching dust motes in golden beams. Richard stepped off the elevator, a coffee in each hand, real coffee from a cafe 3 blocks away, not the bitter hospital cafeteria brew. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying moments from their dinner last night, Grace's laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of her students, how for the first time in years, he'd had a conversation that wasn't a means to an end. He paused in the doorway of her room. Grace stood by the window, a blanket draped around her shoulders. She seemed somehow smaller than yesterday, more fragile, yet the sunlight gave her an almost luminous quality. She hadn't noticed him yet, her gaze fixed on the world outside, a world she would soon leave behind. The view's not much, Richard said softly, not wanting to startle her. Grace turned, a smile warming her face when she saw him. It's New York. Even a parking lot has its charms if you look long enough. He handed her one of the coffees. I wasn't sure how you take it. Black is perfect. Thank you. She inhaled the aroma before taking a sip. You came back. I said I would. People say a lot of things to dying women. Most don't follow through. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. I'm not most people. No, she agreed, you're certainly not. They stood side by side at the window, watching the hospital staff arrive for the morning shift, taxi drivers argue over parking spaces, the city waking to another day it took for granted. I recognized your cologne, Grace said suddenly. When you came in. Without looking back, I knew it was you. The simple admission affected him more deeply than he would have expected. How long had it been since anyone had known him by something so personal, so separate from his wealth or status? I have about 3 days left, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. Richard set down his coffee, unable to swallow past the sudden lump in his throat. Without conscious thought, he moved behind her, gently wrapping his arms around her shoulders. She leaned back against his chest, and they stood there, 2 silhouettes merging in the morning light. I will remember these 3 days for the rest of my life, he whispered into her hair. They remained that way, watching the world continue its relentless forward motion while time seemed briefly suspended in that small hospital room. Eventually, Grace's strength began to wane. Richard guided her back to the bed, adjusting pillows and blankets with unexpected tenderness. "Stay with me?" she asked, her eyelids growing heavy. "Just until I fall asleep." Richard pulled a chair close to her bedside and took her hand in his. "I'm not going anywhere." As Grace drifted into sleep, her breathing growing shallow and even, Richard found himself counting each rise and fall of her chest like precious gems. Fear gripped him, not the familiar fear of losing control or missing an opportunity, but something deeper and more primal, the fear of losing someone who, in the space of mere hours, had somehow become essential. For a man who had spent his life ensuring he needed no one, the realization was as terrifying as it was transformative. Later that day, Dr. Landry emerged from Grace's room, chart in hand, his expression grim. Richard, who had been pacing the hallway for nearly an hour, intercepted him. "How is she?" The doctor sighed, fatigue evident in the slump of his shoulders. "Mr. Hayes, you should prepare yourself. Her condition is deteriorating faster than we anticipated. The pain management is becoming less effective." Richard ran a hand through his hair, disheveled from hours of anxious waiting. "There has to be something more we can do. We're providing her with comfort care." "At this stage?" "No," Richard cut him off. "Not good enough. There must be experimental treatments, clinical trials, something." Dr. Landry studied him with newfound interest. "Why do you care so much, Mr. Hayes?" "From what I understand, you barely know Ms. Wilson." Richard couldn't answer the question, not fully, not in a way that would make sense to this doctor or to himself. Instead, he asked, if money were no object, what would be the best possible treatment for her condition? The doctor hesitated, then relented. "There's an experimental immunotherapy program at Hôpital Saint-Antoine in Paris. They're seeing promising results with cases similar to hers." Hope flared in Richard's chest. "Then that's where she needs to be. Mr. Hayes, you need to understand, this treatment is extremely expensive and not covered by any insurance. The success rate is only about 30%, and even then, we're talking about extending life, not fully curing her." "How much?" Dr. Landry named a figure that would have bankrupted most people. "You could open 3 more restaurants with that money, and there are no guarantees." Richard didn't flinch. "Make the arrangements. You should also know," the doctor added, his voice softening, "that even with treatment, her chances are slim. And the side effects can be severe. Are you prepared to put her through that?" Richard glanced toward Grace's room, where she slept peacefully, unaware of the conversation that might determine her remaining time on Earth. "Look at me," Richard said, turning back to the doctor with unwavering certainty. "I'll do it for her." Dr. Landry's professional detachment cracked slightly. "You understand what you're committing to? The financial burden alone is nothing compared to what she's facing," Richard finished. "Call the hospital in Paris today." As the doctor walked away to make the necessary calls, Richard leaned against the wall, the weight of his decision settling over him like a mantle, heavy, but somehow right in a way few things in his life had ever been. My beautiful family, as we reach the peak of our story, I'd like to take a brief pause to know your thoughts too. They help me know what you're thinking as our story progresses and to connect more deeply with you. If you were in Richard's position, would you give up everything you've worked for to save someone you just met? You know, this moment in our story makes me wonder what truly matters in life. When faced with a decision between our possessions and a human connection, what would we choose? the wealth we've accumulated, or a chance to save someone who touched our heart. Hit that like button if you believe some connections are worth any sacrifice, and share in the comments a time when you chose a person over possessions. Now, let's see what happens next as Richard makes the ultimate sacrifice for Grace. Dawn broke over Manhattan as Richard sat at his desk, signature pen in hand. Before him lay a stack of documents, transfer of ownership agreements, power of attorney forms, liquidation orders. Each page represented another piece of his empire being dismantled. "Mr. Hayes, please reconsider," his longtime attorney pleaded from across the desk. "At least maintain a controlling interest in the flagship restaurant. You're acting rashly." Richard signed another document without hesitation. "Is the wire transfer to the hospital in Paris confirmed?" "Yes, but—" "And the medical transport?" "Scheduled for tomorrow morning, but Richard, listen to me." The attorney leaned forward, genuine concern etched on his face. "You've spent 15 years building this company. You can't just throw it all away for what?" Richard looked up, his gaze sharp. "A dying woman I barely know? Is that what you were going to say?" The attorney fell silent. Thomas entered carrying another folder. "The buyers for the Soho property are waiting in the conference room. They're offering 15% below asking due to the rushed timeline. Accept it." Thomas exchanged a worried glance with the attorney. "Sir, that's a loss of nearly $4 million. Time is more valuable than money right now," Richard replied, already turning his attention to the next document. "And Thomas, have my penthouse listed this afternoon." "Your home?" Thomas couldn't hide his shock. "But sir—" "Just do it." As his employees left to carry out his instructions, Richard moved to the window. Below, New York continued its relentless pace, taxis honking, pedestrians rushing, everyone racing toward something they believed important. Yesterday, he had been one of them. Across town, medical preparations for Grace's journey were already underway. Special equipment was being gathered, medications calibrated, protocols established for the journey. Dr. Landry had assembled a transport team of 2 nurses and a physician who would monitor Grace throughout the flight. In her hospital room, Grace was unaware of the flurry of activity surrounding her future. Richard had insisted that she not be told until everything was confirmed, no point giving hope that might be snatched away by bureaucratic red tape or medical complications. Instead, during his visits, Richard told her stories about Paris, details gathered hastily from books and travel websites he'd studied late into the night. "The light there is different," he told her as she drifted in and out of consciousness. "Artists have tried to capture it for centuries. You'll see it soon." "In another life, maybe," she murmured, taking his words as kind fictions rather than promises. By evening, Richard returned to the hospital, the day's business concluded. His financial advisor had called him insane. His board members had threatened legal action. His chef had quit in protest of the new ownership. But none of it mattered anymore. He refused to even let the thought of what he was losing cloud him. He knew he'd break down if he committed to it. As he entered Grace's room, he carried with him not the burden of what he'd lost, but the lightness of purpose he'd never before experienced. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Hayes had made a decision based not on profit or power, but on something that couldn't be measured in any currency he'd previously valued. The private medical jet waited on the tarmac, its engines humming softly in the pre-dawn darkness. A small team of medical professionals supervised as Grace was carefully transferred from the ambulance into the specially outfitted cabin. For bags swayed gently with the movement, monitors beeped their steady reassurance that she still clung to life. Richard stood back, watching with a tightly controlled expression. He had handled countless high-stakes business negotiations without a flicker of emotion, yet now found himself gripping the handrail of the aircraft stairs so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Mr. Hayes," Dr. Landry approached, clipboard in hand. "She's been heavily sedated for the journey. It's the safest way to transport her given her condition." Richard nodded, his eyes never leaving the medical team as they secured Grace's stretcher. "Will she wake during the flight?" "It's unlikely. The medication should keep her comfortable until we reach Paris." "And her pain?" "Managed as best we can." Dr. Landry hesitated, then added with unusual gentleness, "You should prepare yourself. The next 24 hours will be critical. Even with the treatment waiting in Paris." Richard finally looked at the doctor. "I understand." Once airborne, the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm of medical monitoring and hushed conversations. Richard sat beside Grace, her stillness a stark contrast to the animated woman who had stood up to him just days ago. Her hand lay pale and motionless on the blanket. After a moment's hesitation, he covered it with his own. "We're going to Paris, Grace," he said softly, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Just like you wanted." The flight attendant offered him a drink, but he declined. The medical staff checked Grace's vitals hourly. Outside the windows, darkness gave way to a brilliant sunrise above the clouds, then to the vast expanse of the Atlantic below. Through it all, Richard maintained his vigil, letting go of Grace's hand only when the medical team needed access. Occasionally, he would tell her about Paris, about the places they would see when she was better, the restaurants they would visit, the views they would share. 7 hours into the flight, a sudden alarm from one of the monitors broke the cabin's quiet routine. The doctor rushed forward, barking orders as Grace's oxygen levels plummeted. Richard was ushered to the back of the cabin, where he stood helpless, watching as they fought to stabilize her. 10 minutes that felt like years passed before the crisis was resolved, a blocked line replaced, medication adjusted. "She's stable," the doctor told him, but it was close. Richard nodded, returning to his seat beside her. This time, when he took her hand, he held it in both of his, as if he could transfer his own strength into her failing body. As Paris appeared below them, evening lights beginning to twinkle across the city, Richard found himself doing something he hadn't done since childhood. He prayed, not to any specific deity, but to whatever force might be listening, might care enough to spare this woman he barely knew yet couldn't bear to lose. The landing was smooth, the transfer to the waiting French medical team efficient. Grace was whisked away into the Parisian hospital, a flurry of French medical terminology surrounding her as new doctors took charge of her care. Left alone in the hospital corridor, Richard stood motionless, the past 72 hours catching up to him in a wave of exhaustion. A young nurse approached, offering him coffee and directions to the waiting area in accented English. "Merci," he replied, one of the few French words he knew. As he followed her down the corridor, Richard caught a glimpse of the Parisian sky through a window, that famous light he'd told Grace about, now turning golden as the sun began to set over a city he'd never thought to visit, yet which now held the only thing that mattered to him. Light filtered through Grace's consciousness before sound or sensation. Not the harsh fluorescent glare of hospital lighting, but something softer, warmer, sunlight through partially drawn curtains. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, higher, with delicate crown molding she didn't recognize. Then came the sounds, the steady beep of medical equipment, but beneath that, voices speaking rapidly in a language she couldn't understand. French. Definitely French. Grace blinked slowly, her mind struggling to make sense of these new surroundings. The room was larger than her previous one, with tall windows and walls painted a gentle blue. Medical equipment stood beside her bed, but even that looked somehow different, sleeker, perhaps, or simply foreign. "Ah, vous êtes réveillée," a woman's voice came from her right. Grace turned her head with effort to see a doctor approaching, dark-haired, petite, with kind eyes and a professional smile. I don't understand," Grace managed, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Forgive me," the doctor switched to lightly accented English. "I said you are awake. This is good. I am Dr. Juliette Moreau, and you are in Hôpital Saint-Antoine." Grace frowned, trying to make sense of this information. The last thing she remembered was falling asleep with Richard beside her bed in New York. Now, somehow, she was elsewhere. "Am I? Is this?" Her dry lips struggled to form the words. "Is this the afterlife?" Dr. Moreau's smile widened slightly. "Non, mademoiselle. Though Paris is quite heavenly, I assure you, you are very much alive." "Paris?" Grace whispered in disbelief. A movement by the door caught her attention. Richard stood there, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. Stubble darkened his jaw, and his clothes looked as though he'd slept in them. But his eyes, when they met hers, brightened with unmistakable joy. "You're not in the afterlife," he said, moving quickly to her bedside. "You're in Paris." Grace stared at him, trying to bridge the gap between what she knew and what she was being told. "How?" "The experimental treatment we discussed," Dr. Moreau explained. "It is only available here, at our hospital." "But we never discussed." Grace began, then looked to Richard with dawning comprehension. He took her hand gently, mindful of the fall line. "You've been unconscious for most of the journey and the first treatments." "How long?" she asked. 3 days since we left New York." Grace's eyes widened. "That means today is already the 4th day." The significance wasn't lost on either of them. The 4th day, one day beyond what her doctors in New York had predicted she would live. "You made it," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're still here." A tear slipped down Grace's cheek. "I'm in Paris," she whispered. "I'm actually in Paris." Dr. Moreau checked the monitors beside Grace's bed, making notes on her chart. "The initial response to treatment is promising. Your vital signs have stabilized considerably since arrival." Grace barely heard her, her attention fixed on Richard. "You brought me to Paris," she said, wonder in her voice. "How? Why?" Before he could answer, Dr. Moreau interjected gently, "Perhaps we should let Mademoiselle Wilson rest a bit more before all explanations, non. The treatment is taxing on the body." Richard nodded, but he didn't release Grace's hand. "I'll be right here when you wake up again. I promise." As Grace drifted back to sleep, the reality of her situation followed her into dreams. She was in Paris, she had survived, and somehow, against all odds, she had been given something she never expected: more time. The next time Grace woke, the room was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Richard sat in a chair by her window, his attention focused on a French phrase book. The sight was so unexpected. The powerful businessman hunched over a beginner's language guide, mouthing words silently, that Grace couldn't help but smile. "Bonjour," she said softly. Richard looked up, surprise giving way to relief. "You're awake." How do you feel? Grace took a moment to assess herself. The constant pain that had been her companion for months was still there, but different somehow, duller, more distant. Better, I think. Stronger. Dr. Moreau says that's a good sign. The treatment is working as they'd hoped. Grace pushed herself up slightly against her pillows, and Richard was immediately at her side, adjusting them to support her. The tenderness in his movements was at odds with the man who had carelessly used her dress as a napkin just days ago. "Tell me what's happening," Grace said, once she was settled. "What treatment? How did we get to Paris? I feel like I'm missing huge pieces of a puzzle." Richard pulled his chair closer to her bed. "After you collapsed at the restaurant, I learned about your diagnosis. When I realized what I'd taken from you, your last wish, I couldn't just walk away." "But Paris? That's a bit extreme for an apology." A faint smile touched his lips. "Dr. Landry mentioned there was an experimental immunotherapy program here that might help cases like yours. It's new, still in clinical trials." Grace looked around at the equipment surrounding her, noticing for the first time the unusual medication bags hanging beside the standard ones. "And it's working?" "The markers they're monitoring have improved every day." Dr. Moreau is cautiously optimistic. Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. "Richard, these kinds of experimental treatments cost a fortune. And the medical transport alone." He waved away her concern. "Don't worry about that." "But how?" "It's taken care of," he said firmly. Something in his tone made Grace study him more closely. The slight strain around his eyes, the way his clothes, while still expensive, weren't quite as pristine as before. A suspicion began to form. "When I recover," she said carefully, watching his reaction, "we should go to one of your restaurants to celebrate. You must have connections in Paris too, right?" Richard hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but long enough. "I have no longer any restaurants." The words hung in the air between them. Grace felt her heart contract, understanding dawning with breathtaking clarity. "What do you mean?" Richard looked down at their joined hands. "La Salle, the other restaurants, the properties, they're gone. Sold." "You sold your restaurants? Your empire? For my treatment?" Grace's voice rose in disbelief. "Richard, you barely know me." "I know enough," he said simply. Grace struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his sacrifice. "Why would you do that? Everything you've worked for, everything you've built, wasn't making me happy." He met her gaze steadily. "I spent 15 years chasing success, accumulating wealth, building an empire, and for what? To dine alone every night? To be surrounded by people who feared me rather than cared for me? But to give it all up, just like that. Not just like that. For you." Richard's voice softened. "In the few days I've known you, you've shown me more about living than I've learned in 35 years of existence. You faced death with more grace than I've faced minor inconveniences." Grace felt tears welling in her eyes. "But what will you do now?" "I have enough set aside. We'll figure it out." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "The strangest part is, I don't regret it. Not for a second." "Richard," she whispered, unable to find words adequate for the moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that God, or fate, or whatever force arranges such things, sent me an angel. And now I have you." The words hung in the space between them, a declaration neither had expected but both recognized for what it was. Grace reached up, her fingers brushing against his cheek, tracing the stubble that spoke of sleepless nights spent watching over her. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a quiet acknowledgement of something fragile and precious taking root between them. When they parted, Grace saw in Richard's eyes not the calculating businessman from LaSalle, but a man transformed by the one thing his wealth had never been able to buy, love in its purest, most unselfish form. Days melted into weeks in their Parisian sanctuary. Spring arrived in the city, coating the trees along the boulevards with delicate green buds and scattering cherry blossoms across the courtyards of the hospital. Through the changing season, Grace's recovery progressed with cautious optimism, each small victory celebrated, each setback faced together. The first week was the hardest. The treatment racked Grace's already weakened body with fever and chills, leaving her drained and disoriented. Richard never left her side, learning to interpret the machine's beeps and readings, anticipating when she would need water or another blanket before she could ask. "You don't have to stay all the time," Grace told him one evening, her voice thin with exhaustion. "You should see Paris, not just the inside of a hospital room." "I'll see Paris when you can show it to me," he replied, the stubbornness that had built his business empire now redirected to her care. By the second week, Grace could sit up for longer periods. The doctors noted improved blood counts, decreased tumor markers. What had begun as a desperate gamble showed signs of becoming the miracle they'd barely dared to hope for. Richard surprised her one afternoon by wheeling in a small television and DVD player. "French movies," he explained, holding up several cases. "With subtitles. I thought we could practice together." Grace laughed, a sound that had become increasingly frequent. "You're really committed to learning French, aren't you?" When in Paris, he shrugged, though they both knew it was more than that. Each French phrase he mastered was another way of communicating with her doctors, another tool to ensure she received the best care possible. The third week brought enough strength for Grace to take short walks down the hospital corridor, Richard's arm steady around her waist. The nurses smiled as they passed, whispering among themselves about les amoureux américains, the American lovers. "They think we're quite the romance," Grace told him, translating their murmurs with the French she remembered from childhood. "Aren't we?" Richard asked, his arm tightening slightly around her. By the fourth week, Dr. Moreau's cautious optimism had blossomed into genuine excitement. "The response to treatment is remarkable," she told them during morning rounds. "I've never seen such rapid improvement in someone with your initial presentation." That afternoon, for the first time, Richard took Grace outside. The hospital garden was small but well tended, with benches placed strategically in the sun. Grace tilted her face upward, letting the warmth seep into her skin that had seen only fluorescent light for too long. "How does it feel?" Richard asked, watching her closely. "Like being born again," she said softly. "Every sensation is so intense after thinking you'll never feel anything again." As April turned to May, Grace's strength continued to return. The walks extended beyond the hospital grounds, short excursions at first, to the cafe on the corner or the small park a block away. Richard watched her transformation with wonder, seeing the woman she must have been before illness had claimed her, vibrant, thoughtful, full of gentle humor. One evening, they ventured further, to the banks of the Seine. The sun was setting, painting the water with ribbons of gold and crimson. Lovers strolled along the riverbank, street musicians played, and the distant outline of Notre Dame stood against the darkening sky. Grace breathed deeply, taking in the scene before her. I never thought I'd see this. Any of this. Richard's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with practiced familiarity. I never thought I'd see it either. Like, really see it. They walked slowly along the river, Richard matching his pace to hers, their conversation flowing easily between observations about their surroundings and plans for tomorrow's excursion. In those moments, the hospital, the illness, the uncertain future, all receded, leaving only the present, only each other. I think I could stay here forever, Grace said, gazing across the water. Richard was about to reply when his phone rang, Dr. Moreau's number flashing on the screen. His heart stuttered, conditioned after weeks of medical emergencies to expect the worst. He answered quickly, stepping slightly away from Grace to hear over the ambient noise of the riverside. Grace watched his expression change as he listened, surprise, then something else she couldn't quite identify. When he hung up and turned back to her, his eyes held a mixture of emotions that sent a shiver of apprehension through her newly strengthening body. "What is it?" she asked. "What did she say?" Dr. Moreau's office was bathed in morning light, making the medical degrees on her wall gleam and casting a warm glow over the potted plants that lined her windowsill. Grace sat perched on the edge of her seat, Richard beside her, their hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The doctor entered with a folder of test results, her expression professionally neutral until she closed the door behind her. Then, a smile broke across her face. "Mademoiselle Wilson," she began, sliding the folder open on her desk. "I have reviewed your latest scans and blood work with our entire team." Grace felt Richard's hand tighten around hers. "The treatment is working better than any of us dared to hope," Dr. Moreau continued, turning the folder to show them images that meant little to their untrained eyes, but everything to their hearts. "The primary tumors have reduced by over 70%, and we're seeing no evidence of metastasis in your liver or lungs." The clinical terms washed over Grace, but the meaning was clear in the doctor's bright eyes and softened voice. "You're saying the cancer is in regression?" Richard asked, his voice carefully controlled. "OUI, Monsieur Hayes." "Significant regression." Dr. Moreau's smile widened. "It is not yet a complete remission, but at this rate of improvement, we have every reason to believe that possibility exists." Grace felt the room tilt slightly, the enormity of the news threatening to overwhelm her. After months of preparing for death, the prospect of life stretched before her like an unexpected gift. How is this possible?" she whispered. "A month ago, I was given days to live. The treatment protocol was perfectly suited to your particular cancer subtype," Dr. Moreau explained. "And," she added with a meaningful glance toward Richard, "you have had exceptional care and support. Never underestimate the power of the will to live, mademoiselle." When they left the doctor's office, Grace couldn't speak. They walked silently through the hospital corridors she had first navigated in a wheelchair, then with a walker, now with only Richard's steady presence beside her. In the small garden where they had spent so many afternoons during her recovery, Grace finally turned to face him. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks. "You did this," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved my life." Richard pulled her gently into his arms, his own eyes glistening. "You saved mine first." They held each other as patients and staff passed by, oblivious to the miracle unfolding in their midst, not just the medical miracle of Grace's recovery, but the transformation of two souls who had found each other at the edge of eternity. "I would give it all up again," Richard murmured into her hair. "Everything. Every restaurant, every dollar, every accolade. If it meant having this moment with you." Grace pulled back slightly, framing his face with her hands. The arrogant businessman from LaSalle was gone, replaced by a man whose eyes held a depth of feeling she never could have imagined that first night. "You gave me life," she said softly. "Now let me show you how to live it." 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of a small cafe nestled on a cobblestone street in Montmartre. La Duxem Chance, the second chance, read the hand-painted sign above the door, swinging gently in the autumn breeze. Inside, Richard stood behind the counter, his brow furrowed in concentration as he carefully poured steamed milk into a cup of espresso, attempting to create a leaf pattern on the surface. The result was more abstract than artistic, but the customer, a regular, accepted it with a good-natured laugh. "Encore de la pratique, Monsieur Hayes," the elderly Frenchman advised. "More practice." "Every day," Richard agreed in his now passable French, smiling as he handed over the coffee. At a table near the window, Grace was arranging fresh flowers in small vases, peonies and lavender gathered from the market that morning. Her hair had grown back, curling softly around her face, and her cheeks held a healthy glow that deepened as she caught Richard watching her. The cafe was modest by any standard, just 10 tables, a small counter, and a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to work without bumping elbows. The menu was equally simple: coffee, pastries from the bakery next door, and a daily soup that had become surprisingly popular with the locals. Nothing like the Michelin-starred cuisine of LaSalle. Nothing like the empire Richard had built and dismantled. Yet in the warm, sunlit space with its mismatched chairs and local artwork hanging on the walls, he had found a fulfillment that had eluded him in all his years of accumulating wealth and power. As the morning rush subsided, Grace slipped behind the counter, sliding her arms around Richard's waist as he washed cups in the small sink. "I have to leave for school," she reminded him. "My students are presenting their art projects today." Grace had begun teaching part-time at an international school 3 months ago, once her strength had fully returned. Just 2 mornings a week with the kindergarten class, but those hours filled her with a joy that radiated from her when she returned, full of stories about her 5-year-old charges. "Don't forget we're meeting Antoine about the lease at 4, Richard said, turning to plant a quick kiss on her forehead. Their apartment above the cafe was rented, as was the cafe space itself. The sale of Richard's empire had financed Grace's treatment and provided a comfortable cushion, but they had decided together to live modestly, to build something new that was truly theirs. Later that evening, after closing the cafe and meeting with their landlord to renew their lease for another year, Richard suggested a walk up to Sacré-Cœur for the sunset. It was their tradition, these evening walks, a celebration of Grace's returning strength and a reminder to never take for granted the simple pleasure of movement. The climb to the basilica left Grace only slightly winded now. They found a quiet spot away from the tourists, on a small terrace overlooking the sprawl of Paris below. The city was beginning to light up as dusk fell, a tapestry of golden lights against the deepening blue sky. "Happy?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer from the contentment in her eyes. "More than I ever thought possible," Grace replied, leaning against his shoulder. "Our apartment might be 1/10 the size of your old penthouse, but it feels 100 times more like home." Richard took a deep breath, his hand slipping into his pocket to touch the small velvet box he'd been carrying for 3 days, waiting for the perfect moment. "Grace," he began, turning to face her. "Before you, I measured success in square footage and bank balances. I built restaurants people waited months to enter, but I never understood what it meant to truly nourish someone." He lowered himself to one knee, there on the terrace above Paris, the city that had given them both a second chance. "You taught me that real wealth isn't what you have, but what you're willing to give up for love." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring. "Will you marry me?" Grace's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, then found her voice. "Yes. 1,000 times, yes. I have something for you too. I got it this morning but wanted to save it for a special moment." Richard opened it to find her latest scan results. At the bottom, in Dr. Moreau's handwriting, "Complete remission. Felicitations." Their embrace silhouetted against the Paris skyline, two people who had found in each other not just healing, but home. "My dear family, you know, life doesn't always give us what we want, but sometimes it gives us exactly what we need." Richard lost his fortune but found his heart. Grace lost her time but gained a future. Their story reminds us that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the courage to give everything for love. How often do we cling to the things we believe define us, our careers, our possessions, our carefully constructed identities, only to discover that what truly matters emerges when those things fall away? Richard Hayes built an empire of restaurants where people came to be seen, yet he himself remained unseen until a dying woman looked past his wealth to the lonely soul beneath. Grace Wilson faced death with dignity and grace, planning not for decades but for days. In accepting her limits, she found a kind of freedom that Richard, for all his resources, had never known. Their paths crossed in a moment of arrogance and humility, his arrogance, her humility, and from that unlikely beginning bloomed a love story that defies explanation. It reminds us that transformation is possible at any moment, that the human heart can change in an instant, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as our greatest losses. This story touched me deeply, and I hope it moved you too. It reminds us that even in our darkest moments, light can find its way in, sometimes from the most unexpected sources. Richard and Grace's journey shows us that second chances aren't just plot devices in stories, they exist in real life for those brave enough to recognize and embrace them. If you know someone who needs to be reminded that life can change in beautiful, unexpected ways, please share this video with them. A simple click could be the reminder they need that transformation is possible, that love can appear when hope seems lost. And if this story resonated with you, if you felt that flutter in your heart when Richard gave up everything to save Grace, or that warmth when they built their new life together, become part of our family. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so we can continue this journey together. Because stories like Richard and Grace's deserve to be told. Stories of redemption, of sacrifice, of love that transcends circumstance. I search for these story ideas and craft them with care because I believe they have the power to change how we see our own lives. Thank you for spending this hour with me. Until next time, my beautiful family, remember that you are valued, you are loved, and you are never alone on your journey. Your own story is still unfolding, with chapters of hope and renewal waiting to be written.